My name is Maria Vaz, and I am the provost here at Lawrence Tech, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the third Harold Otelling Memorial Lecture. Dr. Harold Otelling was a faculty member here at Lawrence Tech that passed away 3 years ago, very unexpectedly, and he was a great faculty member, a great mentor to many people, and so we feel very, very good that we can honor his memory every year with this lecture. I want to thank a couple of people. First, actually, I want to introduce his son and his daughter-in-law that are here with us today. So George Otelling is here, and his wife, Jenny. And I also would like to thank the committee that actually looked through and found the right person to come tonight. So I just mentioned their names. Dr. Melinda Phillips, she is the department chair of our Humanities, Social Sciences, and Communication. Mr. Dick Dengate, that is right next there. Thank you very much, Dick. Jason Reed. Karen Havens is also a faculty member at Lawrence Tech, and then Tracy Cash Thomas, the executive assistant of the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. And so that's it for me. Again, welcome. I know that this is going to be a great lecture, and I'm as anxious as you and listen to the speaker tonight.
Whatever. Thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. And let me start by saying I do a lot of different things, and makes me sort of different from the typical academic you might meet, because I stay involved in the practical world a lot. And this project comes from an engagement that I had, maybe 4 years ago, something like that now, going to an institute at Dalhousie University in Halifax, and they were looking for a market for their port, and it took me a day to figure out, first, what am I doing here, and second of all, to say, I think I have your market. And from that, that's really the origin of this concept. And so I'm interested in what you think about it, what your response is, any questions you might have. So I'll spend the first 30, 40 minutes talking about it, and then let people jump in with their comments. So the notion here that starts this, thinking about this, is geography is destiny. And geography is a very important factor in where a place, what kind of place can become any kind of industrial center. And when you're talking about transportation, you have to have very specific industrial components, and you have to have geographical components. And my argument is that we have all of those right here, and it's sort of a hidden treasure that's unrecognized. So first of all, we have the Great Lakes River crossing to the Midwest. We'll take this off and step out from behind here, see if I can get away with this. We have this location that's a close location, and you'll see from a map that I'll put up in a minute, what I think people often forget living around here is just how close that is and how significant that is. It's a central location for North American transport because of the access that's available. It gives us, this whole overall route gives us the opportunity to take advantage of the lowest carbon footprint and the lowest cost routes that could be available to anybody trying to get into and out of the Midwest. And I would make one further comment, and that is the Midwest is actually kind of the golden center. It is a major focus of transportation around the world. People always say, and they don't say Detroit, they say, how do I get to Chicago? How fast can you get there? What's the cost? Because Chicago has historically been that zone. And I would argue that this is the 21st century Chicago if we take advantage of that. So the existing infrastructure actually gives us a great opportunity. First of all, we have there are only 6 Class 1 railroads in North America, and 4 of them come through here. It has the 2 only major transcontinental railroads. So a lot of us Americans had it driven into us. The transcontinental railroad involves this spike that happened out west about 150 years ago, and that's actually not a transcontinental railroad. That's spanning to the West Coast, which is certainly important for the time, but that's not the same as a transcontinental railroad. So I'll show you the significance of that in a bit. There's no other major city that has that level of service. So we're really it. We actually have the great opportunity if we choose to take advantage of it. We also have a great nexus of interstate highways, U.S. interstates and Canadian interprovincial highways, and they all focus right on this area. And you'll see I define this area as coming from Port Huron down through Detroit. So it's the 2 crossings that count. It's not just one. And the crossings you can see by the existing infrastructure are major focal points for transportation and have been for a long period of time. The dark lines that you see are the railroads. The light colored lines are the interstate highways. They, of course, follow the same pathway. So all of that is right there and available. And it's the only place in the Midwest where such a crossing can be made, period. The only other choice, if we muffed it completely, is Buffalo, Niagara Falls, and the Niagara Frontier. But when you go across the railroad, if you go across those bridges, you've only gotten to Buffalo. I don't want to pick on Buffalo, but it isn't Detroit. And so you really haven't gotten to the industrial heartland that you want to get to, because markets drive freight and passengers to the central part of the United States, but especially freight. So if you look at the map, you can see that there, and I actually have a pointer, but I didn't bring it with me, but you can see the pinch point that is the Detroit area. And you can see that all the rest of it is water. And people often think about the Great Lakes as their great resource, and that's true. I look at it as a big barrier from a transportation perspective. You can't get across those in the wintertime. You can't get across those cheaply. It's a major problem, but there is one spot in our area where you can just get across them on a bridge or in a tunnel. And so our global access for the Midwest starts in Detroit and is the primary, at least the first approximation, goes to Halifax. Halifax is one of the deepest ports in North America, and it has long been a major port in the British Empire, but it's a deep, ice-free port, has all that year-round access, and you get there by rail. The other alternative going east is Montreal. And Montreal is more shallow. That's a big difference. But it serves the heartland, the hinterland of Montreal, and generally the Midwest, the industrial Midwest of Canada. So that means a lot of freight goes in there automatically. The one that people don't think of is this one, and it's going to Prince Rupert and Vancouver in British Columbia. Make sure I don't go too far with my little pushes here. So freight wants to go from in a global economy, it wants to get to the Midwest, and it wants to get here as cheaply and quickly as possible, and it wants to do so, it's got to do so on rail. So people ask me all the time about what's wrong with the Great Lakes, and we can have the St. Lawrence Seaway and all that. The problem with the Great Lakes is that they're frozen a lot of the time, and if you go look at it, you realize that you can't go through the Welland Canal with a very big ship. So it simply is not economical, which is the reason why we have to think rail, and it's a whole lot cheaper to go rail than other ways. Prince Rupert is just 5 days away, Halifax just 3. In fact, it's a very close shot across the continent from here. So I want you to think globally like that. Let me make sure I'm pointing. Yep, there it is. I got to point the right direction here. I'm right-handed. I grab it with my right hand, it'll change here. So you see, Prince Rupert is also deep and clear, and Vancouver is deep and clear. So all of our ports are available to us. They're available to us as an inland port, which is the reason why I titled my talk about the inland port, Detroit as an inland port. And here is the way that we capture the global market. So through Halifax, we get all of that area circled in red. And you see that the world kind of ends over there at Colombo, Sri Lanka, but in fact, our target zone includes all the way over to the Pearl River Delta in southern China, which is where the heartland of so much manufacturing. A lot of that manufacturing is moving out of China, but it's moving to the west towards Vietnam, and probably once they're done with this shakeout into Burma, Thailand, all those kinds of places, and that's going to be definitely, without any question, within our reach. And it makes the closest connection, actually, via this route. But if there's another part of the world that we have to deal with, and that is China. China, Japan, Korea, all the stuff on the East Asian coast. That is reachable through Prince Rupert and through Vancouver, but Prince Rupert is the one that's growing. This doesn't have any interference. All the way, again, to the Pearl River Delta, basically. The lowest cost route to get to North America, to get to the center of North America, is this route. And there are two railroads that make this. My colleague from the CN back there brought some maps. I'm glad to lay them out for people. This is borrowed, stolen. It does have CN on the bottom from their website, but it's a really clear way to see the route map. And this is the best route map to get to the Midwest of North America that exists. All the other routes go through big cities that get in the way. They go through the East and West Coast U.S. ports. The East Coast U.S. ports are generally too shallow, or they go straight into New York City, so you got to deal with all that congestion. On the West Coast, they go into L.A., again, more congestion. And it's a long ways, and we have this mountain range, or series of mountain ranges in the center, which means they have to climb mountains. And from Prince Rupert, this CN railroad slides down a corridor that has the least amount of climb necessary. So that's part of why I say it's the greenest route. And when it's green, it's the lowest cost route to a significant extent, because we're not going to pay for as much fuel. And we're not going to use as much fuel, which means we're greenest. There is another railroad. Cover your eyes. It's the CP. I didn't know it would show up that way. That's interesting. Oh? So there we go. So much for that. You can't even see. Did you sabotage this? Okay. So you can't even see it because for some reason or other, part of it doesn't show up. I didn't know this would happen in translation. I can see it from here. I just can't see it up there. So imagine this here is Vancouver. This here is Detroit. I think that must be us here. No, it couldn't be. Must be over here. There's Detroit. CP goes to Montreal, and CP goes on the other direction to Vancouver. It is not the lowest cost route, not the fastest cost route, but it is a competitive route, keeps price down and competition up in our area. So that's why it's important. I think that the CN is the most likely partner. So based on that, I've got some numbers here for the Detroit access to global markets. And you can see that going through Halifax, we have Colombo, Sri Lanka, which is a pivot port at the tip of India, basically. Sri Lanka is the country south of India, but they have a really big port, and it's acting right now as a transfer port, and it's growing, and it's got deep water. So that's all the India trade can come through there. Singapore, the next step east, and Hong Kong, the next step east, gives us the shortest possible times and shortest possible routes going through Halifax. Going on the other direction with an East Asia focus, we get the same time from Hong Kong, you say within tenths of a day, the same time, and less from Shanghai and of course less from Korea. All of that is to provide the lowest cost freight transportation. All transportation will tend to do this. Freight transportation especially will do this. It's seeking the lowest cost, fastest, most reliable route. And that's simple, right? It's an easy thing to do. We can actually do that. We can do that here because we have the right geography, because we have the right infrastructure, because we have the right attitude. For the customer, it's a big savings. We had some models run for us by Menlo Logistics. It's pro bono, so I had to live with whatever port they could pull off quickly and compare. But going to and from Hamburg to the industrial Midwest, so a major part of our transportation is coming from, freight transportation coming from, to and from Europe in our trade. But we save Detroit via Halifax, compared to Chicago, we save 2 days. So it saves a lot of time, and time is money when the inventory is sitting in those containers. When we go through New York, when we go through Norfolk, Hampton Roads, Virginia, you can see it's a lot longer. And when it's a lot longer, that means the freight is sitting in those containers for a longer time, and the carrying cost is very high. If there's any value at all in that commodity, the carrying cost is very high. So that amount of savings can save up to $1,000 per container, between 5 and 20% on shipping cost. When we first had Chrysler to the table to talk about this, they said, if you can save us $100, we're talking. We're interested. Well, we're talking up to $1,000, depending on where it's coming from. So we can save a lot of money. And looking at this in a graphic way, we can see that it saves up to $93,000 per year for 100 containers. If you're shipping 1,000 containers a year, that's real money. So that's how our region becomes competitive, because we drive down the cost, we make the service faster and cheaper. Companies will want to be here. We don't have to beg them to come here. This is the place to be. You want to be in the place where you have access to global markets. Everybody in manufacturing wants access to global markets, and you can actually get that here. We have a whole lot of assets that you know about in this area, but access to global markets is not what people think about first, and I argue that is the thing they should think about very first. We have those other things. We need the access to global markets. Looking at Halifax and British Columbia gateways, you can see the size of ships. This is a major change that's happening in the world's logistic market today. Ships are getting bigger. They're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And ships actually have economies of scale. In transportation, economies of scale are questionable because usually you don't get to have scale this big. But in the maritime world, you do. And if you look, you'll see Halifax down there at the bottom as the deepest port in North America. Actually, I think Prince Rupert is a shade deeper. The other port, that's really deep. We're talking 16 meters. And when you've got 16 meters and you don't have anything up above that gets in the way, that's called air draft. You have draft, the ship's draft going underwater, which you see in blue, and you have the ship's draft going under bridges, which you don't see. And that's what is a big impediment in New York. So we have, on the ports on East and West Coast that we can partner with, we have that great draft, and we have it year-round, and we have rail lines that are designed to get the freight down to this region as fast and trouble-free as you can possibly get. And so that's a huge advantage for us. So what's happening is the modern really big ship, up until a few years ago, was in this 4,800 TEUs. TEU is a 20-foot equivalent unit. Those little boxes you see that they haul around on those trucks, there's a box behind it. They are divided in 20-foot and 40-foot. That's the standard measure because Malcolm McLean made it that way 50 years ago, an invention of the container. So we measure the volume of throughput in any intermodal port around the 20-foot equivalent unit. So 4,800 TEUs was big. It is now small, and it can't get into Montreal anymore because the river is too shallow. So a big change has happened this year with global warming, or at least the lack of rainfall in the Midwest that didn't drain into the Great Lakes, that didn't drain out of the Great Lakes and into the St. Lawrence Seaway. They had to turn ships away or bring them in half empty. So the newest ships that are coming out are really big. This is 11,000 TEUs. Those ships are actually there. OOCL brought in a ship of that size in Long Beach this year. But the newest ships, we were happy to get those ships. And 11,000 TEUs is big. The newest generation of ships is 50% bigger. And that 50% bigger is going to knock out a lot of ports that thought they could compete for that freight that can't compete for that freight. And the cost on the new Maersk Triple E ships, so they say, they won't come out till next year, but so they say, if it's fully loaded, is a 26% reduction in cost per container for moving it. So that's going to create an economy of scale that's going to be very significant, that's not even in the calculations I showed you before. So these are often called, there's kind of different languages, but super post-Panamax ships. They require the all-water route, but they can go through Suez, but they won't be able to go through the Panama Canal. Panama Canal is going to be expanded. They said it was 2014. Now it looks like it's going to be 2015. It's going to be expanded. It's in process. But it's not going to be able to handle anything. I don't know if it could even handle that 11,000 TEU ship in there. But the 15,000 and 18,000 TEU ships, there's no way it can go through there. So I did a check, some research on this, and 37% of the container fleet, of the ships that are container ships today, are already too big to go in there. So this is an overwhelming trend towards bigger, cleaner, more efficient, lower cost. That is going to make up for the additional rail leg distance that we have. So I think, anyway, our numbers show that the cost will be low enough as a result of doing this that it will make sense, because of the ships, that it'll make sense to be able to bring the freight in long distances by rail. And that will make many of these East Coast ports regional ports, not national ports. So we're looking for a national railroad or a global railroad, that kind of a scale of railroad, and we're looking for a global scale of port, and we think we have those. So where do we build that here? So that what really counts to people in Detroit is, can we really do this here? So we have to build it where we can optimize the network density. This is a network density problem. That's what transportation lives by. We had a meeting last year in October. A vice president from CN who was coming to speak called me up to see if I knew anything what I was talking about. And he just said, you know, mass is good. So if we can get mass, the term is often used as massification, but if we can get mass at either end of this line and fill that system up, it will reduce the cost immensely. We have to build it where we have the network density in this region, where we have the best access to divided highways and airports and all those facilities, that we have strong infrastructure assets, that there's low bid rent, because we have to be able to build in a place where we can afford to put the land together, and high property vacancy rate. Is this sounding familiar yet? and have large contiguous areas in need of development. Getting even more familiar yet? So we think we have that place, and that again fits with the geography, fits with the global economic trend. 20 years ago, we probably couldn't have said this, but we can say this now and for the next century. And this is a picture up close of that railroad system in the Detroit area. And what you see in the orange kind of color is existing zoned industrial land, much of which is underutilized. So it's already present. We already have it. And if you look at a map of vacancy, property vacancy rates, which tends to go along with low bid rent, you can see there's a whole bunch of those areas. And I don't want to get real specific because I don't want you all run out and suddenly buy up a bunch of property. There's certain people in town might do that, it'll be discussed at dinner. But those areas that look the worst, when I first went through this, once I had reframed my own head and went there with a colleague who's an industrial real estate developer, we would both have the same reaction. We look at devastated places and say, wow, this is great. We can turn this around. So maybe we're all crazy, that's okay too. But these places that you see that have been most emptied out in Detroit are actually great places to think about building the broad scale of what needs to be done. Now, what are those components? So I've listed a number of these components because I include them in my economic analysis. So there is the Ambassador Bridge Gateway. That's going to be an important crossing, should stay an important crossing. There's the Detroit Intermodal Freight Terminal, or the DIFT, which the MDOT is obsessed about building. Anybody here from MDOT? They always like to hear I mentioned it. Very important thing. That's in the Southwest Detroit Livernois Yard. There's now called the New International Trade Crossing, which is on the ballot basically this next week, or whenever it is soon. The new bridge. And then what we have to be thinking about is how do we take advantage of these assets to turn into jobs, to turn into an industry. And it's freight villages, intermodal yard. The intermodal yard spawned the freight village. The intermodal yard spawns the warehouse district and the distribution centers. It becomes the place where everybody will want to be once we've led the way. And once they want to be there, when Walmart wants to be there, other people are going to want to be there too. And I'm very confident that that's an option. I include the CP intermodal yard and a CP tunnel, because the CP needs to have a new tunnel. That's the one that's over there by the Ambassador Bridge right now. That's an old 100-year-old rail tunnel. It's too low. So you can't put double-stack containers through that safely. So it's not a 21st century tunnel. So they need to build a tunnel, something that we need to have them build, and we need to get them to put an intermodal yard there and make this their landing spot in the Midwest. CN, obviously, that's our number one, because CN has that expedited transcontinental route that actually really does have a link right up in here, and it's all on their lines. So single track service or single line service is a really big deal. They don't have to fight with any other railroad to get access to their own rail lines. And that's not true of all of them. It's not true of a number of them. So, and CN needs to have a freight village, needs to have, an area will develop around that once that intermodal is developing. And these things don't happen like you wave your hand and suddenly one of these things happen and everybody comes running. This is a strategy. And then I suggest an electric road train connector that would be on specially made roadways for this purpose to connect those pockets that I showed you as various railroad and highway infrastructure components call out to be developed for intermodal and distribution center facilities. Then they need to be connected, and probably best to be connected off the main roadway. And the technology is now there to do induction charging on these kinds of trucks. It can move these vehicles from, can pull these containers from area to area to make all of Detroit into an immense inland port facility, a true target. And we also have the Aerotropolis, which is down Detroit Metro Airport, is a contributing factor. This makes the Aerotropolis successful. Total investment we've estimated is a little less than $5 billion, which is a fairly small amount of money considering what is going to be created when we do this. Now, this is not all going to happen at once. Nobody does it all at once. But if we start leading the way and start encouraging that, a lot of that, most of that probably will be private investment, because this is a place to come to make money. I did a macroeconomic analysis with the help from the Center for Automotive Research, and what we came up with was total jobs of about 150,000 jobs created by this combination enterprise that I have here, with the exception of the Aerotropolis is not included in this calculation. So some of these jobs are construction, ongoing, right now and ongoing, but some of it is an operation, and then all the macroeconomic multiplier factors that happen as you do this. Once you start, you do the one, every time you put somebody to work, it's going to put somebody else to work, because that person's making money and is able to buy stuff, and that'll cause the economy to grow, causing other people to get hired to sell stuff to them, whatever. That's the multiplier effect. So, as a conservative multiplier, railheads actually have multipliers in and of themselves in the neighborhood of 5 to 1. And the reason is because they're in the place that they are in the global supply chain. That's why they're so important. That's why cities and states fight so hard to get these kinds of things established. Georgia just put $180 million state money into the Port of Savannah. They just voted to do that. And they've been doing it right along. They're just doing it even more aggressively now because they can see the threats. So the Gateway also enhances the Aerotropolis, if you're familiar with the Aerotropolis. This is the project that's been a big thing for Michigan, Southeast Michigan, for some time. And these are their numbers that I've pulled out of their documentation that they gave me. We're talking about something in the neighborhood of 65,000 jobs over a 20-year span as they build this thing out. But they're really beating their brains out to develop this, to build this out, because they don't have the help that we could provide if we could drive enough freight into this area that it would feed the machine, if you will. It feeds the machine. So that gives us a total set of jobs created, over 215,000, that we can visualize just by the things that we know about right now. So for Michigan, what does this do? Well, we calculated that it generates $10.5 billion annual economic activity in current dollars in the region by 2018. That's a big kick forward, and that can change the whole climate of Southeast Michigan, which has been a bit depressed for a while. It generates $1.37 billion in additional revenue, tax revenue, to the state and all the municipalities, and it helps us grow out of our current funding crisis. I'm a big proponent of growing your way out and not cutting your way out. I don't think you cut your way to prosperity. You have to grow your way to prosperity. So that's my pitch, and I'm glad to answer questions, and I hope it's begun to get some thinking going. Anybody want to try? Throw something. Yes, Jason.
Do you think it'll take the secondary services moving in first to help attract a lot of this new opportunity, or will that be a secondary development once the initial investment?
So there's a couple of things. So the first step is to understand, and this is one of the things that I find most difficult to explain around here, not from these parts, right? So you don't have to have that. So people think you have to build a factory to make a car, which probably makes sense for making cars, right? But for making freight go through, it works very different. First you build the car, then you build the factory. That's the transportation economics difference. And that's something that the more I teach it now, and the more I realize that's a gap. So, first step is to drive the freight to the Detroit ramp, period. And as you drive the freight up, you take advantage of business opportunities that are out there. And when you do that, who starts locating here? Well, one of the first things you have is freight brokers, service. Freight brokers look around for freight that needs to be moved. I've got a route for you. They match them up. They're like little marriage brokers. Put them together, get them on the route. So you have, that's an example. There's a very substantial sector of skilled work that does that. Second thing that happens is that once you start driving that volume up, you push Detroit, or you push this whole region to where we're maxed out on capacity. We can't handle it. So CN has their Ferndale yard. My goal is to flood it with so much freight they have to do something, they have to build something. So I'm going to make it hard for them to stay where they are. We want to give you more work what to do. As that happens, you put people to work building stuff. Other people have to go to work feeding the people building stuff. So it's kind of a cycle. I don't think that you go out and seek out the logistics people, the service people, for example, until you have something for them to do. So the state has to take a lead. The state, and it could be just a county government or a city government or whatever, but we've kind of concluded that the state has to get behind this, and the state has agreed. They just haven't figured out how to grab onto it and get behind it. They're still working on lining up all the deck chairs or something, I don't know. But they're lining that all up. So we're hoping they're not deck chairs, right? But it requires kind of getting the state to make that move to say, we're going to go this direction. I have one of my colleagues at University of Michigan guy says, blue ball that way. Now, for those of you Michigan State people or something, sorry. But that's a nice metaphor anyway. And it basically, somebody's got to decide where we're going to go. And once you've decided where you're going to go and you start building that, you start building all those ancillary components. One of the really good things about this is that the lion's share of the operating jobs will be mid-range skilled jobs, because you don't have to have a college degree to empty and sort and repack another container. So people who've been downsized out of auto have a place to go to work. So I'm not suggesting we replace the people here with a new class of yuppies from some other place. I'm suggesting that everybody will, this is an industry where a lot of people can do stuff. And once it becomes the place to be, because I've found a way to cut your costs for transportation, manufacturing people want to be here because they will get the closest access to global markets. So that's kind of the plan. Yes? Well, so the state, and I'll use the state from the political science language of the state, so it could be the state itself, which we're pushing on. We just had a meeting with the lieutenant governor. You know, we think they get it. But it can be the mayor. I've met with people, all sorts of people at different levels. Brooks Patterson, he gets it. So, I mean, there's a lot of people who get it. Ficano was actually one of the first people to get it. So that was good. But it's been a couple of years, and he's been busy lately, hasn't he? So, I mean, those folks need to get to line up and get behind it. And that is one of the Michigan dilemmas. That's the hardest thing to get done, right? So we've heard a lot about that. But I think we're getting closer. I say that, I'll go take some medication later. But I think we're getting closer to that. So it's a very painstaking process, much more than I'm the impatient one and I'm the academic. So, because I can see where we got to go. This is essentially, however, carving an avenue through which the private sector can drive their trains. Trains, boats, ships, planes, cars, trucks, whatever. In other words, this is a perfect example where partnership makes sense. Because without the state cooperating, you do not have the ability to get the land organized together to get the job done. You don't have the ability to throw some money behind marketing this particular activity and this function and all this, to go out and make the deals that needs to be made. We've been trying to find a partner in the private sector that can profit from it. And interestingly enough, we don't yet have anybody who said, oh yes, I'll put money on this, and here's how we'll make money on it. So they haven't quite figured that out, but it's normally the job that the state has. So in Winnipeg, they're doing this for their region. Calgary did this. They're doing it in Savannah, Georgia. They did it in Virginia, a lot of red states, by the way, if you notice. So they did it in all these places, and they threw the state behind it, and that essentially allowed the private sector to get organized. It's kind of the state acts in a true partnership to drive a project of this scale forward. Without the state, you do run the risk of a big player coming in and people reacting negatively to that. So there have been times that I won't get into here that has happened, even in this state, believe it or not, where we've chased away development. So the trick is to do this in a collaborative way. And I don't think it's very hard. It's kind of painstaking, but it's not really that hard. But it can be done. I think it can be done. Yes?
How important or how large an impact do you think the bridge proposition will have on your vision?
Proposition 6.
I just asked how important that vote will be in terms of the vision you set in life.
The question is, what will happen if that bridge proposition were knocked down? Or if the bridge initiative passed, and you have to have a 2/3 vote. It would be pretty crippling, but it wouldn't be crippling to the vision that we've got. So again, CN and CP already have tunnels to get across. CP needs a new one. CN has got a state-of-the-art one up there in Sarnia, Port Huron. So we essentially, because it's driven by rail, we get around that problem. We still would be shooting ourselves in the foot, because one of the components of this project was the freight village that ought to develop, the logistics park that ought to develop around the base of the new international trade crossing. Because that's the place where you want to be if you're in this business. You want to get close, you want to get as close to the crossing as you can to actually do your sub-assembly work and all that kind of logistics work, sort and segregate work that gets done. So we would be cutting off one leg. But we're not going to actually sabotage the whole project because it's really driven by rail, and rail is a privately owned infrastructure. Thank you very much. And they have already built what they needed to get across that river. Does that help? Yes?
Is there an opportunity, you talk about Global Freight Gateway, is there an opportunity to talk about public transportation along with this? Is there an opportunity, or is that kind of cause even more of a roadblock?
Well, I don't think it gets in the way. I think it's just different. So we actually talked about this kind of stuff. I think they were all set out to have dinner with me to prep me on these questions. So this is good. So one of the things is the private transportation thing. And I'm going to flip back over here and illustrate something. If you build something like what I'm talking about, you got to have a way for people to get to work. And one of the good things about this is at least I can identify at this point a number of places that can become centers of supply chain activity that could actually provide a basis for making this happen. And that would mean people don't have to go too far to go to work. However, you need to have a bus system that works. We discussed the light rail, and that's all very interesting, but that only goes, from there to there. So certain kind of people are going to go from midtown, downtown, and back again. But that's not going to get us the job done because we need access to all these other places where people live and work. So if we were to actually imagine, just for the sake of argument, we were to create logistics parks in these areas here, all the people around there need to get to work, and they're not going to walk to work. So with a bus system that functioned, you could do it. So the two things work together. The bus system would enable all of this to be successful. And if you start to build this, people are going to be saying, I need to get my employees here. I can't get my employees to work. Why don't you guys build a bus system? And that's really, I think, what's going to happen. Yes?
And I'm sorry, two questions there.
Okay.
Because obviously in Europe, this is a great fact. Europe is a lot smaller than the U.S. and North America here, but is anybody studying the European rail system and public transportation, bus system, as you said? Because it works.
Yeah, the European system is really different from ours. So I'll give you one little important difference. The railroads in Europe, because they're a bunch of socialists, you probably heard that, right? I think it's probably been in the campaigns or something. But so they own the railroads. They have privatized substantially. They're all different because, there are a bunch of other little principalities. You know how those Europeans are. But they're, the one thing I believe is common everywhere is that the rail lines are owned by the state. And so, and I think this is always true, right? Okay, I got my expert up here. So, believe that there aren't any exceptions to that are significant. And that means where they have privatized, they have taken the freight system and they've privatized the operating companies. So when I first was having this first meeting in Halifax some years ago, there was a woman from Erasmus University in Rotterdam, and she said, oh, we have 14 operating companies fighting, beating each other over the head to get access to the port on our rail lines. So they can control, the state can control the use of the rail lines, just like we can control the use of the highways some kind of a way. But the operating companies want to get on it, and they pay to get on it, right? So for the freight movement aspect, it works differently than it does in the States, because our roadways are privately owned in the state. That creates a big barrier for us. So I think so the answer would be, I think we have to live with what we have. It's privately held, it's what it's going to be, and figure out how we can take advantage of that. And our public transportation, my stand still is that ought to be publicly provided, because it's a good that everybody gets a benefit from. You do not want, just like you don't want to have, and I'm going to really say something controversial, you don't want to have a privately owned international crossing that controls 25% of your country's trade. What's with that? Because private monopolist will distort the market completely. So actually he was actually promoting the idea that competition is bad. If they build that new bridge, there's going to be a rate war, and people are going to be trying to charge even less for crossing the river. And I thought, who are you selling this idea to, So, but railroads work a little different, so you have to kind of work with the structure that you have. And it's different from transit in Europe, which is, except for the Brits, I think, publicly owned. But I'm not positive. Yes?
How do you see this as being funded?
Mostly from the private sector. So we've actually asked the state for some funding. They asked us for a proposal. We gave it to them. Haven't heard anything back. We actually know where we want to go. We're actually doing it on a volunteer basis right now, meeting with a very big company in this region, who's really excited about us doing this. And we held something last fall, October 11th, and we had 30 of the biggest companies in this region. We had a vice president of FedEx flew up just from from Atlanta just to the meeting. We had all kinds of people like that. If we create the opportunity for them to make money, they'll come and invest money to make money. So I think that most of the investment is going to be privately done. If we make CN's business so great, have so much freight coming in here, they're not going to complain about putting an investment in. What they're not going to do is put an investment in and sit back and see if anybody shows up. That would be foolish. I totally agree. It's called a sunk, transportation's investments are sunk costs. Once you build it, you're stuck with them. The last thing you want is to build a white elephant that nobody want to use. So that's why I think the state's job, the government's job, the public sector's job is to make it really a good proposition for the private sector to want to come in, and then most of that investment. All the stuff that I was popping up on, did I get it? Probably went past it. Nope, this one. And I have a lot of detail behind this, but all this kind of stuff is actually private sector. So there's a limited amount of public sector. There'll be access roads, there'll be that kind of stuff, but it's really not much. They're not making the big investments. All we asked for them was just enough money to go out and make the business case to customers and build the export and import business. Yes?
What kind of limitations are there for the railroad based on like where it runs through neighborhoods, where it crosses certain traffic paths? I mean, I know I live right off of the CN. I live close to the Ferndale terminal. So I'm real familiar with how loud they are and when they go through and, you know, so I'm just wondering like,
Yeah.
what is that, what kind of impact will that have on neighboring traffic, neighborhoods, places?
Right.
I mean,
So.
I've been stuck on 8 Mile for a half an hour for a train.
Yeah, we could talk for a long time on this. I don't think I think the Ferndale yard is a fine yard for what it was made for, but they're going to need something really different when we give them a couple of 100,000, 300, 400,000 containers a year. That's what I want to do. They're going to need to be in a different place. They're going to need to be someplace else along their line. The government, I learned this years ago, the railroads are more powerful than the government. So, so they're very powerful and they have a lot of ability to make things happen around them. But I'm familiar with a lot of other cases where they've collaborated with the state. So one of my favorite I like to pull up is the Alameda Corridor, going from the Port of LA and Long Beach out to downtown LA. For years, there's over 200 grade crossings in that corridor. They have more than 50 trains a day going through there. You can just imagine. At their peak before our economy tanked, it was more like 70 or 80. So they'll be back. And that was intolerable. So we put in $20 billion of government funding to sink it. And so it goes over the top. So once you have enough reason to do this, that's a public-private partnership, and the public sector's job is to get the people around on the streets, and the railroad's job is to get the freight moved along the railroads. So I think that sort of answers that question. I think that there are places in Detroit that would be ideal for this. I have it on good information that they would be ideal for this, and they would involve some rerouting of streets, making overpasses, making underpasses, doing some things like that. But I think all in all, not too big. I mean, it would be an investment that would make sense because we'll have the wealth to pay for it when the time comes. And it doesn't need to conflict with people. There will be a rail going by. They don't need to blow their horn as long as there isn't a grade crossing. So one of the things that you do is try to find a way to help them get rid of the grade crossings. Write them a check, they'll be glad to do that. Anybody else? I think they're going to throw me off, give me the hook here. That it? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. And on behalf of Lawrence Tech, I would like to present you this little token of our appreciation for sharing with us the vision of a plan that could revitalize this region. And Lord knows we need an economic renaissance in Southeast Michigan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.